This is Season 4 of Southpaw Deep Space Nine. Season 5 will be released on the Southpaw Pod Patreon. This episode was recorded on July 2nd, 2024. We are back with Southpaw Deep Space Nine Season 4. If you don't know what SDS9 is, it's Southpaw's complete SDS9 watch-along show, where we watch every episode, recap it, and analyze it. We are your hosts, Scott and Sam. Today, we are discussing Bar Association, the much anticipated episode. Scott, can you recap this episode?
There's nothing I would rather do. So, the Defiant, which is under Worf's command, returns from the Gamma from a mission. No signs of the Dominion doing anything. And Jadzia points out that Worf definitely has a crush on the Defiant. Quark is quiet because there's this Bajoran holiday, which is the time of cleansing, is very quiet, and it is affecting business. And Rom is suffering from a painful ear infection. He collapses. Quark dismisses his concern. Lita, a Davo girl who's a little sweet on Rom, but also sometimes hangs out with Bashir, is frustrated at the coldness of Quark. Bashir finds Rom has neglected his health due to lack of vacation, due to lack of sick days, due to lack of the ability to do this. And it turns out that Rom has had a life-questioning ear situation for weeks. And Bashir's suggesting a union to stop exploitation, but Rom hesitates. Throughout the episode, the Ferengi have trouble even saying the word union. The Ferengi, their goal is to exploit, not worry about being exploited. They are super capitalists. You just deal with it. They don't want to destroy the table. They want a seat at the table. And doctor visits are not allowed in Ferenginar. No sick days. No anything. And Lita is honestly worried about Rom. Rom discovers that Quark has been cutting salaries to offset the losses during the festival as a claim to not fire staff, or he's like, we need to cut the pay or lay people off, and it seems dubious. Rom pleads with Quark to not do this, to make sure everyone gets paid equally. Quark refuses, and it strains their already sort of tense relationship. If you've been watching season 4, they're starting to come to heads. And as Quark reminds them, they aren't brothers here, they are employees. But Rom threatens Quark. And Jadzia and Worf are hanging out. They're doing a holosuite sparring, but they are interrupted. They catch a thief in Worf's quarters, which prompts Worf to confront Odo about station security as they see that someone has robbed Worf's house. Odo defends Deep Space Nine's challenges, citing that even the Enterprise had security lapses. And later, Rom, who has been inspired by Bashir and his words, has a clandestine gathering with bar employees to discuss forming a union, as he sees Quark is using a dubious reason to screw over workers. Some employees, especially the Ferengis, are stunned by Rom's proposal to form this. a union, knowing that it defies the Ferengi Commerce Authority, the FCA, their rules. This is super against everything. But Quark is cruel, and the workers admit reluctantly that they are unhappy. And Rom even uses Ferengi logic to say capitalism sucks. Rom urges them not to fear the FCA. He advocates that they need rights, they need sick leave, PTO, vacation time, and points out all the different employees who would benefit from this. And eventually, they agree to unionize. They agree to confront Quark. At the infirmary, Rom seeks advice from Bashir, who is actually surprised by Rom's bold move. And Miles is there and to have a cyst looked at, and he shares his family's union history and supports Rom, but warns him. See, Miles is a descendant of the famous strikers Sean O'Brien in Pennsylvania, a union man in 1902 who was murdered. Because people who start unions in the past, obviously, only in the past, have been murdered. In operations, Miles is repairing systems while Worf is venting about the constant breakdowns and the crappiness of the space station, preferring the busy station life and his Enterprise downtime. And he's just lamenting and lamenting. But Miles is like, look, I'm never bored and I love being needed. Tomato, tomato. Quark returns to Quark's and he finds all of his employees. They are presenting union demands, and he initially mistakes it as a prank. Rom clarifies, this is no prank. They're serious. They have a guild of restaurant employees, but Quark scoffs. This is not real, but Rom and his people threaten to strike. They want increased pay, they want sick leave, they want a living wage, they want to be treated with respect. A novel concept indeed. And Quark again tries to dismiss it, but is shocked when all the employees walk out, and he is forced to take them seriously. The strike begins with the union even thanking supporters by distributing gold-pressed latinum to people that are not scabs, and most of the station boycotts Quarks. In a bid to manage without staff, Quark uses these faulty holographic waiters from a Lecipian and robots and all this other stuff and AI and tries to do robot labor, but it's not working. It's almost like, Sam, that there's no such thing as unskilled labor. Quark asks Odo to intervene, but Odo, under orders from Ben, refuses unless the strikers cost his order, even though he admits that he doesn't like strikes, he doesn't like any of this. Big surprise. Meanwhile, Bashir and O'Brien are taking bets on who's going to be a scab, on who's going to enter Quark's, the upper level entrance, and are kind of nonplussed and disappointed when Worf walks in. Off screen, they confront Worf inside. It escalates into a brawl. They end up in Odo's cell, and Bashir has been injured. Ben wants to know what's going on, and Miles explains it just started with an disagreement that got out of hand. Ben decides to release him in the morning and leaves Bashir disappointed in the behavior, and Ben wants to figure out a way to end the strike. Summoned to Ben's office, Quark is ordered to end the strike and negotiate with Rom by the end of the day. Quark protests that unions just validate Ferengi principles, that this is not what they do. But Ben reminds him that the Federation has significant leverage because they haven't charged him rent, they haven't charged him utilities. They're like, if you don't do this, we're going to charge you so much money. The threat of money, the threat of bankruptcy. Quark realizes that he's in a dire sitch and agrees to meet with Rom. When they meet, Quark immediately offers to bribe Rom to end the strike with Latinum, but Rom refuses, insisting that they will strike for as long as necessary. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Back at the bar, Quark faces Liquidator Brunt and two Nausicaans. They come from the Ferengi folks, and they are not happy. They are determined to end the Union by any means that they need. Rom meets with the employees to update them on the recent events. He talks about the bribe. He explains that he denied it. He assures them Quark will eventually yield, but there are hesitant folks. They are citing the Ferengi rule of acquisition 211 about the exploitation of employees, and it's for, not against. And Brunt barges in with Nausicaan enforcers. Some fold, begging for forgiveness. Brunt, in a fit of anger, describes the brutal consequences that the Union would face from the Ferengi people. Although Rom reminds them that these Ferengi threats happen on Ferenginar, and they are not on Ferenginar. Brunt warns them the FCA has reprisals, but will be merciful if returning to work. Otherwise, the threat of severe penalties await them and their families. Brunt and the Nausicaans depart to decide their course of action, but the Union resolves to persist and fight.
A note to our listeners. If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, like early releases of Southpaw Deep Space Nine, our fictional narrative podcast, Fighters Brew, break-free versions of our shows without interruptions like you're hearing now, bonus articles, Fighters Brew transcripts with extra content, Liberation Martial Arts Online, as well as our private chat group on Discord. You can also make one-time donations at Ko-Fi or show your solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com.
On the promenade, Worf and Miles reconcile after their scuffle. Worf is just troubled by station life and decides that he will move to the USS Defiant and will just live on a starship. Not weird at all. Rom and Lita have a moment. Quark is desperate to end the strike and approaches Rom once more, but he is rebuffed. Quark tries to warn Rom of the escalating FCA involvement and what might happen if the Union does not break. But Rom is resolute. He is steadfast. He is unmoved by threats. At Quark's, the Nausicaans are playing darts on themselves. Brunt is venting his frustration over the Union's resilience and is trying to figure out a way to quash the resolve, determined to break everyone and make examples. Brunt initially contemplates targeting a few people, and they contemplate targeting someone close to Rom. But they're worried that if they just got to Rom, that would create a martyr. They initially considered Lita, but she's too soft. And they changed their mind due to misogyny. So they realized that the best loot is Quark. Later we see Quark in the infirmary, recovering from a brutal beating by the Nausicaans. Rom arrives at the scene and sees Quark is all messed up and has narrowly avoided death, only because Odo stopped the Nausicaans. And despite having Brunt and Nausicaans arrested, Quark will not press charges. He does not want reprisal from the FCA. He doesn't want an even harsher demon, a worse liquidator, to come and punish Rom, because they do love each other, these brothers. But Rom is undeterred by the injuries of Quark, and he remains focused. He must keep the Union intact until Quark agrees to what they have requested. And then eventually, Quark relents. Under Rom's pressure, he agrees to meet the Union's terms, though Rom will orchestrate the outcome to make it seem like a victory for Quark. But here's the thing. Not only does Rom step down from his position in the Union, which causes it to dissolve, but it does ensure that the employees receive their desired pay raises to take effect by the end of the week. He has other plans. Meanwhile, Worf has settled into his new quarters aboard the Defiant, where Dax, Jadzia, presents him with a gift of her favorite Klingon operas. Despite Jadzia's reminder that station life won't change for Worf, Worf believes that hopefully the station will eventually adapt to accommodate him. As the Bajoran festival concludes and patrons return to Quark's, we see Rom appearing in a Bajoran uniform. What? He announces his new role. What? He's going to be on the night shift of the engineering crew, because as we know previously, he's really smart. Quark expresses concern about Rom's ability to manage without his oversight, but Rom assures him he'll be fine. Rom assures that he'll help with the stuff. Rom assures that he will always be there for Quark, but most importantly, he insists on being served snail juice as a paying customer. We understand that there's a transition. Rom quits and realizes that he is better without Quark, and perhaps that not working with him, their friendship can grow.
So, this is the episode that every leftist I know references to say DS9 is leftist. But is this it, or is there going to be more? Because Ferengi episodes aren't ever mythology episodes.
So, one, my friend, this is not a monster of the week. This lays some groundwork for some important character development. Also, the greatest episodes of Deep Space Nine, many of which you haven't even seen yet, there's still the worst episode, but when we do that episode,
There's the worst one?
there is a unquestionably worst episode of Deep Space Nine, which actually does involve Quark. However, when we get to this episode, we're not going to do it alone, and we may not even talk that much for that episode. But for the most part, the best episodes are yet to come. This is one of people's favorite episodes, and for good reason, because it doesn't make fun of unions. It doesn't talk down. In fact, it's like fairly honest. It even talks about like the pitfalls of being in unions in America in the turn of the century. I mean, even mid-century. I mean, Harlan County is like the film about unions is 50, 60 years later, and the sort of thing with like Pinkertons and all this terrible stuff still happens. And in fact, to get super nerdy, if you're into Magic the Gathering, no, I'm serious, dude. About half a year ago, this guy found some Magic the Gathering cards that hadn't come out yet and revealed them on the internet. And the Pinkertons showed up at his house, dude.
What? I've never heard this.
The owners of Magic the Gathering, which are connected to Hasbro, hired frickin' Pinkertons, the original Union destroyers, to the fact that they're written into the law of the country. Pinkertons showed up to scare a Magic the Gathering fan.
Wow.
So if you think about turn of the century union busting, you have to go hand in hand with the Pinkertons, which people either have found out through the Weezer album, which has some problematic ass songs in there, Red Dead Redemption, which I've never played, so I can't call it, or Magic the fucking Gathering. I'm serious, man. You could, if my bingo card was like people find out about union busting through playing Magic the Gathering, I wouldn't have guessed.
No.
But Miles O'Brien talking about union busting and how deadly it was really special. So this is one of the most, I mean, obviously the episode about the Bell riots is pretty out there. This is one of the more out there, like, oh, this show has a leftist slant, but it's not the only episode. And there are more episodes that go into it. In fact, a comrade who I met recently in Baltimore who's doing a book tour, David K. Seitz, who wrote, as right now, the only academic book about Deep Space Nine, A Different Trek, Radical Geographies of Deep Space Nine. The cover references this episode. And there's like a whole chapter about it. And he's agreed to be on the show one of these days. And it's very exciting that people are even considering looking at Deep Space Nine through an academic lens, besides us, because we've been looking at Deep Space Nine from an academic lens for several seasons. So this episode is very important because it also lets you know what a show that stays in the same place allows you to do.
Now, we've discussed how DS9 discreetly brought money back to make some points. And you need money to create scarcity, and you need scarcity to create desperation, abuse, and exploitation, which underpins this episode. Now, what first struck me in this episode is how DS9 has no labor rules, no oversight, and no business regulations. I've mentioned this before, but the station reminds me of anarcho-capitalism, or like an anarcho-capitalist mall. And on the show, the general attitude for some of the workers or people around work has been, if you're exploited by Quark, work hard to become like Quark. And I think that was even reiterated in this episode. Don't overthrow the exploiter, become the exploiter. I think that's how ROM operated for a long time. This is how poor people defend capitalism because they see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. This is what liberal and conservative capitalists tell you. Move up in the system. Don't abolish the system. If the system gets abolished, how can you get your turn at the top? But in reality, however, there's more to it than that because the West has done an excellent job of making any alternative to capitalism seem far worse than capitalism. So some begrudgingly support capitalism, seeing it as the least bad of the bad options. Western media is crucial to purveying this message.
Absolutely.
Now, why did they bring back money, even though it doesn't make sense to the in-world logic? For exploitation and the capitalist system to work, you not only need money and wages, but you also need ways to have that taken away from you. Otherwise, you only accumulate money. And without scarcity, money is meaningless. Capitalism makes the world a company world. Capitalism creates desperation and oppression because it takes things from you and you have to pay to get them back. Money is just an obligation. It only means anything because of debt. That's why money is a debt obligation. Mm-hmm. There has to be more debt than notes to pay it back. Not being able to pay for things is the justification for violence. The difference between capitalism and the system before it is that capitalism pretends to justify its injustices. The scale of capitalist exploitation is so great that they need to pretend to justify it. If you love the Southpaw Project, become one of our financial supporters. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, And you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. We can't exist without your contributions. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at southpawpod.com. The episode only discusses a part of capitalism, the business owner and labor, rather than the entire privatized system, in which everything belongs to someone and they rent and sell it to you. But all of what has been stolen was once public. Capitalism can only put you in the frying pan if everything else is on fire. Capitalism works because you have no freedom. You're always under duress, and decisions made under duress are not choices, but an illusion of choice. Mm-hmm. If everything on DS9 is free, you have no duress to work. It's like a rich retiree who works for fun. So the stakes are about the principles of the matter rather than material conditions. So as hard as the bar employees have it, it's far, far worse in real life for real people because we don't get free food, free rent, free clothes, free energy, and replicators that can make whatever we want. There is no communal ownership. But just as Odo the cop has to answer to the police chief, Cisco, Quark, the business owner, also has to answer to the landlord, who is also Cisco. Cisco is also a spiritual leader of Bajorans. He's also the captain of the Defiant and DS9. Talk about the accumulation of power to one central figure. But Cisco is a nice dad dictator. So there is an unexplored power system on DS9, and capitalism has a system of hierarchy and enforcement that they mapped onto this pre-existing system of the DS9 station and Starfleet. And it mapped on pretty damn well. Something else that occurred in this episode was the attempt to replace workers with AI, which you noted. That's hitting too close to home. Something Hollywood people are thinking a lot about. Probably some of these very DS9 writers are thinking about that scene very differently now. Mm-hmm. The scene about the ethics of passing the picket line was interesting because O'Brien and Bashir were literally talking about what passing the picket line meant and what it says about you. But then the writers chose Worf to pass the picket line, which I found interesting. It could be read a lot of ways. Story-wise, it tells us about Worf's mental state. It could also be read as hand-wringing about fighting over politics and how we should all be civil. A very liberal message. As far as the story goes, Worf came off as a libertarian, off-the-grid guy, which actually works nicely with the greater political themes of this story.
Yeah, Worf is like a kind of guy that would have initially gotten to like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, and then like start listening to like Hassan Piker and be like, oh wait, this is wrong. And all of this is stupid. Let me figure out my own way.
Maybe he would have been somebody who might have listened to Peterson and Rogan, but then found Southpaw.
Exactly.
And he's like, no, I like martial arts and I like honor and culture. Let me check out Southpaw.
I mean, that's basically Worf's story arc, is being into like strong, powerful, cool shit, but finding the wrong people that are into it, which is often the path for people like us who are into martial arts and things like that. It's just like, I was talking with my friend who I haven't seen in years yesterday in person about how hard it is to be a leftist and your favorite sport be mixed martial arts.
Yeah.
It's hard, dude. And I can imagine Worf being like, I really like mixed martial arts, but the fans are really terrible.
Yeah, that's a true statement. So going back to the episode, Rom quotes Marx and they leave it there, which you mentioned. And of course, Quark wouldn't like it, but they don't dunk on it, which is nice. There's a lot of things they don't dunk on. Then we meet the FCA, who are worse cops than Odo. That's the thing. A cop in an environment without money or without property is not the same as a cop protecting property, which goes all the way back to when Black people were considered property. All cops might be bastards, but not all cops are the same. Cops that arose from enslavement and settler colonialism are fascist cops. FCA acted like old school strikebreakers, like you mentioned, Pinkertons, but also the federal government got involved in stuff like this too. And of course, FCA, they work for the capitalist government, so everything they do is legal as far as Ferengi government is concerned. They crushed Quark's eye socket and almost killed him, which connects nicely to the foreshadowing that O'Brien did. So a nice bit of writing. But it reminds us capitalism is violence.
Mm-hmm.
You need a violent system to enforce the whole thing. That's the thing. There needs to be stakes and consequences for all of this to work. And so you need scarcity and violence. You don't play ball with capitalism, or you can't pay your debt, or you can't pay for goods or for housing, the cops will come for you.
Mm-hmm.
Step back and think about that. Having to pay for housing because all this land was taken and rented back to us. However, since the story has to be wrapped up in one episode, the union and strike worked. But when I thought this was a self-contained episode with no consequences, Rom becomes an engineer for the station. Scott, is this an actual change beyond this episode?
Rom is one of the most interesting character arcs in the show.
See, I love that minor characters on the show can grow. We saw this also with Nog. Scott, is this a pattern in DS9 where even minor characters matter?
Spoilers, aside from like Morn, every character gets an episode.
Wait, I heard Morn even gets an episode, doesn't he? Or
Sort of.
sort of, okay.
Like pretty much if you're like, oh, that character is cool and they showed up more than once, you will learn more about them. There aren't a lot of throwaways, which is the gift of a show that happens on one place.
So you touched upon this earlier, but how do you rate this episode and how important is it to the mythology?
It's really hard. So I'm just going to give it a 4 because we're about to deal with some bangers. Like, so it's just not necessarily next episode, but soon. So I can't just like, I have to be mindful, but I love this episode and I love how this episode probably like taught little 14-year-old Scott about unions. And because in retrospect, my favorite TV show growing up was Deep Space Nine, and my favorite video game was Final Fantasy Tactics. And I'm like, and I'm like, oh, I'm a leftist. I'm like, huh.
Let's talk about tactics a little bit because that's the game where instead of having a pivotal main character, it's for people who just loved team play. Because I love that game too, because it was all about how you organize this misfit group of people who any of them by themselves aren't that strong, but you put them together in the right combination and you organize them and you give them the right turns and everybody matters. And that's what made the game.
Yeah. And it's also about the pitfalls of power and the proletariat. Even though like some of the characters who represent the proletariat are bad. And that's okay. That really is okay. But, you know, I remember my uncle once told me, he's like, you know, everybody's liberal until they get their first paycheck, you know? And then I got my first paycheck and I was like, wait, why am I a socialist?
You went the other way.
Yeah. And those are the kind of people I mess with. People that, you know, are trying to figure out how all of us can eat, not how some of us can eat.
You know how I mentioned on this show how you connect the dots and somehow you do it and you somehow connected the dots to Final Fantasy Tactics. You did it. I didn't know it was possible. I didn't even know it was coming. It was not on my bingo card, but you did it seamlessly.
Dude, and I'm just going to do my best to not go into lore and talk about Final Fantasy Tactics for the next 20 minutes because I could, but I won't.
Okay, so how important is this episode to the mythology?
Understanding that ROM is built different is very important to this show.
So his character doesn't reset back to the way he was.
No, dude.
How important is this episode for fans? Because I feel like that's a different metric. Because I feel like even though you gave this episode a 4, just because you have to be objective and think about the entire series, and we've already given a few 4.5s, right? And we don't want to just give those away. But there's a different metric for the fans.
For fans, this is a 5-star episode.
This is really meaningful for fans, right?
Yes.
It's like an episode people who aren't even going to rewatch the series might just rewatch this episode.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a cult episode.
Oh, yeah.
Scott, can you tell us about the next episode?
300-year-old Bajorans.
Until then.